All right, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Most of us know Denis, but for those of you who don't, he's been birding for over 40 years. His passion for birds has inspired him to travel the world looking for species he has not seen before. His first international adventure was to Costa Rica in 1994, and in the last 30 years, Denis has visited over 30 countries on every continent except Antarctica. His favorite birds to pursue are hummingbirds, thus the topic of this presentation tonight. 10 trips to Ecuador and half a dozen trips to Costa Rica have given him many opportunities to expand his hummingbird list. Add to that multiple trips to Belize, Peru, Brazil, and Mexico. Rounding out the search areas include trips to Venezuela, Colombia, Guyana, Bolivia, Argentina, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. He's covered a lot of ground and has a lot of stories to share. When Denis is not traveling, he's teaching classes at the Morton Arboretum, which he's done since '97. Denis also devotes countless hours to bird habitat restoration at Fermilab and with the DuPage Forest Preserve District. And with that, I will pass it over to you.
Well, thank you. I haven't said anything yet. I do have a question though. I was just curious, how many people here did the spring count? Great. So what were some of your best birds that you had? Osprey?
Orchard Oriole.
Orchard Oriole? Shout them out. Or what'd you get?
I cleaned up in the afternoon, so I had a lot of grackles.
Nice. How many? Any other cool bird? Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, the girls we spent a dozen.
Okay. I was talking to Joe after the count, and he's pretty sure he had a anhinga fly over his house while he was working on the totals. So that's a pretty good bird. I claimed one last year, but the photos didn't prove it out. So, but anyway, thanks a lot for having me out tonight, and it's going to be a lot of fun. I have a lot of stories to share, as Robert said, and I guess we'll get right into that. So the topic is hummingbirds, the gems in the air. So what we have here is that little bottom bar is there again.
You want the lights down a little?
Yeah. Do what down?
The lights.
Oh, down, that would be great. Yeah, I'll get it. It was. That'll go away too. Oh, it came back. You think it comes back when people need that? That'll go away in a second. Okay. So my name is Denis Kania. Here we are again. So here's a couple of the hummingbirds that I've been able to take pictures of. I'm not a photographer by any stretch, so you will see a lot of my pictures in here, but that's not what my forte is for sure. So here's the topics that I'm hoping that we'll cover tonight. You can memorize this list, and if I leave anything out, then ask me at the end. But we will cover some of the cultural significance. I've got a lot of talk or things I can say about the world distribution. A lot of cool stuff from my recent travels, and then some of the topics or things that we're going to do in the near future. So I've got a lot of plans to find some more hummingbirds. So culturally, hummingbirds have been represented for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's no wonder that we admire them as well. So here's just a few examples. There's a carving here, a stone carving of a hummingbird. Here's the famous Nazca lines down in Peru, and I've not seen this for myself, but it just amazes me that they can create something like this, because the only way you really get to appreciate it is from in the air. And then this image here is actually a petroglyph, and when I found it on the internet, it said it was from the National Monument outside of Albuquerque. So I finally made the trip out there, and I asked at the visitor center where I could find this one. So I finally tracked this one down, and so this is actually my photo now. And that brought me almost as much joy as finding a new hummingbird. So, and you can see other things here. This is Melissa's shoulder. She's probably zooming at home right now and she's probably furious, so that's great. And yes, they are all gems. You can see here just by some of the names that are attributed to hummingbirds. We've got amethyst and we've got topaz and ruby and sapphire, tourmaline, all sorts of, gems. So all are represented in the various colors that we see in the hummingbirds. And a little bit about history of hummingbirds. At one point in time, there was a separation, a diverging paths for the two groups of birds, the swifts and the hummingbirds. And that happened about 57 million years ago. So taxonomically, they're very, very closely related, and they have a lot of similar characteristics like wing structure and the structure of their feet. You'll never see a hummingbird walk. You'll never see a swift walk. They don't have the strength in their feet to do that. So I think that's interesting. And in fact, when you look in your field guides, if you ever wondered why, when you're flipping through your field guides, you'll see swifts, and then the next thing you always see in your field guide will be hummingbirds. And that's because those field guides, if they're organized taxonomically, they put those two groups close together. But then another split occurred about 17 million years later, and we had two various groups of hummingbirds. The typical hummingbirds, which our ruby-throated hummingbird would be a representative of that group. And then we also have the hermits. And that group we find mostly in tropical regions in the south. So we don't have any hermits up here in North America. I think one of the most amazing things I found when I was researching this talk many years ago was that the oldest known fossil of a hummingbird actually comes from Germany. And there are no hummingbirds in Germany. There haven't been hummingbirds in Germany for I don't know how long. They're all in the Western Hemisphere. So it's amazing to me that the oldest fossil that we have, which is 30 some million years old, comes from the wrong continent. So here's where those hummingbirds are located. I've done a quick sample to just see what kind of totals they show for various countries. And my favorite country to visit is Ecuador, where there's 132 species. Now, Colombia has more species, it's up to 165, but it's 5 times the size of Ecuador. And likewise, going down into Peru, that's another country that's 5 times the size of Ecuador, and they're down to 124. So to me, the epicenter for hummingbirds really is right here in Ecuador. And if you think about it, that's where the spine of the Andes and the equator intersect. And so you really get a lot of biodiversity in that region. And I've been to most of these countries at least once. Again, Ecuador 10 times, Peru a couple times. The reason I focus on that area so much is because in the Andes, we do get a lot of hummingbirds. And I don't think there's too many left actually in Ecuador, for me to search for anymore. So branching out a little bit more, so we get into Central America, and you can see that as you're moving north, with the exception of Mexico, which is a huge country compared to all these others, you can see that the numbers are starting to dwindle, and it's going down, leaving Colombia and moving through Panama, which I can't see that down there because this little bar keeps showing up. So they're at 59 in Panama, and as you work your way up through Middle America, using Belize or Guatemala as an example, you can see how the numbers are decreasing. Once we get all the way up into North America, we're talking about only about 15 regularly occurring hummingbirds. And if you go all the way up to Alaska, you're going to have only 1 species up there currently. I think Anna's is starting to work its way up there as well, but Rufus is the hummingbird is the only one that you would expect to find that far north. And I didn't talk about that when I had South America up here on the board. But if you get all the way down to the southern tip, down to Tierra del Fuego, you're only going to have 1 hummingbird species there as well. So as you leave that center, epicenter there in Ecuador, the numbers keep decreasing as you go in either direction. But that's not all. So if you go out into the Caribbean, you get a lot of endemic birds on all these little islands. Islands are famous for having a lot of endemic birds because of the isolation. So in order to scoop up all those hummingbirds, now you're going to have to go and visit all these little islands. And so I've made the trip just recently to Puerto Rico. I've been to Jamaica. I do have some plans to get to the Dominican Republic and Cuba in the near term. And I'm trying to get Trinidad and Tobago onto my list as well. So every time I go out into one of these little islands, I'm going to pick up a couple endemic species of hummingbirds, which is great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our migration patterns, and this is for the ruby-throated hummingbird. And the data that I'm showing you here is from 2010. So that must be about when I put this program together for the first time. And what it's showing is that, you know, our hummingbirds are starting out down here in the south. Some of them will go all the way down to the southern tip of Florida. Others are going to go around the land bridge through Texas and through Mexico, and they'll go as far as Panama. That's the furthest south I've ever seen a ruby-throated hummingbird. But they're now making their way back up. They're here already in our area. And in 2010, they actually, the first ruby-throated hummingbird sighted in our area back in 2010 would have been on the 4th of April. So they were probably here close to about that time this year too, but the numbers are lower initially, so you don't see a lot of them. I just saw my first one yesterday, and I put my feeder out right away, hoping that I'll find some male that'll want that as his territory. And if you get the male to stick around, then you're gonna have a bunch of females, and you'll have something you can watch all summer long. So at any rate, you can actually you can go to this website and it'll track as the hummingbirds are moving north, which is kind of cool to see. There's another species that shows up here in the east on occasion. In fact, it's shown up very close to where we are right now. Several years ago, it's maybe four or 5 years ago now, a rufous hummingbird female showed up in Lisle, Illinois. I've always kept my feeders out late in the fall, hoping to snag a migrating rufous hummingbird. And I've yet to do that. So I finally threw in the towel when one was as close as Lisle, and I went and saw that one. So where this bird typically is migrating is along the western coast. And that's, as far as we know, that was their normal migration path. So after, oh, maybe 15, 20 years ago, we started seeing rufous hummingbirds showing up in Florida. And maybe they were there all along, but people are now looking for them. Landscapes, designs have changed a lot, so there's a lot of flowering plants down there. There's a lot more bird banding going on. So we detected that rufous hummingbirds are showing up in Florida, and not just Florida. So they're in Georgia and South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama. All of those southeastern states are picking up rufous hummingbirds. Well, they have to fly through Illinois to get there. And so that's why we started picking up rufous hummingbirds in Illinois. And the ones that we do get, it seems like they migrate through very late. So I don't know why we have that pattern, but if you go on eBird and start poking around and looking for rufous hummingbirds in Illinois, you'll find that many of them are in late October through November. And this bird here in particular actually showed up on December 1st. Stuck around for about 4 days. It really loaded up on fuel on its last day, and then it took off and not seen again. But before that happened, somebody from downstate came up and banded the bird. So if it shows up someplace and somebody gets that band number, we'll know what happens to our little rufous hummingbird. What I think is really interesting about this map is that not only is it showing the pattern of, you know, where these hummingbirds are supposed to be going, and all of these symbols here represent different periods of time as they're tracking north. Well, I'd like to draw your attention to Maine. Look what's going on there. So we have spring records now of rufous hummingbirds showing up in Maine. And I think it's just a matter of time before we have a breeding population east of the Mississippi for that species, probably in our lifetime. So I think that's pretty amazing. So we're witnessing a pretty dramatic change in what's happening with rufous hummingbirds. And so this page actually shows for all those southern states or southeastern states, and these numbers are probably a little bit old. They certainly didn't get any lower, but they could have gone a little higher. But you got Alabama has 12 different species that have been recorded in the state. Louisiana has 12, and so on. And these are the makeup of the birds that are showing up. So a lot of them are birds out of the west, but we are getting them out of the south as well. In fact, we have Bahama woodstar coming from the Caribbean, and the green-breasted mango would be from the Caribbean. So it's pretty interesting to me that you know, birds are actually moving northward into these southern states. So let's talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of our hummingbirds. And there's a considerable size range for these birds. So as a benchmark, we have the ruby-throated hummingbird here, which we're all familiar with, and that's 3.5 inches long. and 1/1300ths of an ounce. So everybody hold up their pinky. And don't be shy. That's a ruby-throated hummingbird, okay? Now think about the bee hummingbird, that little hiding my data again. So that's only 2¼ inches long. So even shorter than your pinky, and it's 7/100ths of an ounce. And then if you look at the giant hummingbird, that's a hummingbird that's about the size of a starling. And we're all familiar with starlings that we see in our backyard. So it's 8½ inches long and 7/10 of an ounce. So that's a pretty big hummingbird. And as far as flight, so ruby-throated hummingbird that we're familiar with, that's 70 beats per second in flight. The bee hummingbird is 80, and the giant hummingbird is only 10 beats per second. And so when that bird is flying and hovering at a big agave, feeding off of some of the flowers up there, you can almost count those wing beats. It's flapping that slow that you can actually see and distinguish individual wing beats. And you could never do that with a ruby-throated hummingbird, right? So I think that's pretty interesting. So over time, birds and plants have developed quite a relationship, and they're actually very dependent on each other now, at least hummingbirds and the plants. So they've co-evolved so that there's specific plants that are targeting, let's say, specific hummingbirds and vice versa. So the hummingbirds have evolved to have certain bill shapes. The plants have evolved to have certain tubes that the hummingbird has to enter in order to get to the nectar. And so that co-evolution has been strengthened by the fact that the plants are now creating more nectar for those different pollinators. They didn't need to create as much nectar for insects. Insects were around long before the hummingbirds and acting as pollinators, but the hummingbirds have come along, and they are a much more reliable provider of moving pollen to other plants. For one thing, they can fly when it's wet. Your insects are all going to shut down when it's wet. So think about that vast range that we talked about. And these birds are way up in the Andes and they're in Amazonia. It rains sometimes in those places, believe it or not. And also it gets very cold in some of those places. And that's another thing that shuts down insects. So hummingbirds end up being a very reliable pollinator. If they get that treat of an extra dose of nectar, they can now fly greater distances to get to the next source of nectar. And so we have, we'll talk about it in a minute, but we actually have hummingbirds that they call trap liners. And so they move through the forest from place to place to place. And they're actually targeting a specific flower. And so they're now delivering the correct pollen only to that correct plant as it's moving through the forest. So as I say here, there's a bill for every job. So you have all different types of shapes and sizes in bills. We go to the extremes of a sword-billed hummingbird here and here, where the bill is actually probably at least as long, if not longer, than the body of the bird. And then we get down to a purple-backed thornbill, and that is probably a little over 1/4 inch on that bill. And then we have these odd shapes like a white-tipped sicklebill. So he would be in that hermit family of hummingbirds, not the typical hummingbirds. And he would be targeting a very specific heliconia that suits his bill shape. So it's very interesting. You can just, camp out at one of those spots and you can wait for a sicklebill to show up, and they will. Again, here's some examples. These are mostly hermits. The Jacobin here is not, but all these others are hermits, or in the hermit family. You can see they're not flashy like our typical hummingbirds, and we'll talk about color in a minute. But you can see they're all hitting very unique looking flowers. And when they're doing that, the way that the entry point is developed for these flowers, it means that the anthers are going to hang just right and deposit pollen on a certain spot on the hummingbird. And so when he goes to the next flower, which he may have to trap line his way to find another flower that's going to provide the nectar, he's going to be delivering that pollen to the correct place. So I think it's a pretty amazing thing how it all has worked out. So there are feeding strategies. Now here, we don't really see or witness that very much because we only have one species of hummingbird. And we all know how aggressive hummingbirds can be about their food sources. So they're very, very protective. And they wouldn't, if we had other hummingbird species here, you could see how there would be, excuse me, there'd be a lot of conflicts. So we get a little more of that as we move out west and there's more hummingbird species. But if we go down into Central and South America, we get into places where there might be 20 different hummingbird species all working in the same area. So in order to divvy up the habitat, they come up with different strategies for getting their sources of food. And so here they all are. So we have the high reward trap liners. That's kind of something I was talking about already, where they're going and visiting a very specific flower, but that next flower patch may be a great distance. So in order to make that journey and to make it worthwhile, these plants are going to have to produce a lot of nectar. Then we have low reward trap liners, which are making trips as well, but the reward is probably not as great. The plants are not creating as much nectar, and they probably aren't having to move as far. We have generalists that really are feeding on all sorts of situations. We have territory holders, and that would be our ruby-throated hummingbird. So when the male comes up, he's going to establish a territory, and he's going to guard that territory like crazy against all other males. But he'll always welcome females in for some strange reason, and he will always invite them to come in. And once he mates with one female, he goes on and continues to protect that territory. That female will set up her nest somewhere in close relation to that territory. And then the next female comes along and they will mate. And then that female also is going to set up, assuming that this territory is a really good one. And the reason they're picking that particular male out as their mate is by the quality of the territory that he's protecting. So he's really a good male and has good genes if he can protect a really good territory. So it all kind of makes sense. So then we have territory parasites. And so these guys are going to come in and they're too small to actually control the territory. So they just do little sneak attacks. They come in and they'll grab what they can and they get chased off. And then they make a living by just, sneaking in whenever they can. And then we have nectar thieves, which is a very interesting category. So there are some species of birds that will actually go into the base of the flower head and they will drill a little hole in there. So some hummingbirds have figured that out, and so they will watch and they can see where these holes are and they'll go and utilize those holes. And then there's others that are actually managing to slip in and avoid the stamen altogether. And they can get in. I have a picture that'll show how they're just kind of slipping in to the side without ever coming in contact with any of the reproductive parts. So here's an example of a rusty flower piercer. This is one of the birds that's creating these little holes for hummingbirds to use. And so if you look at this flower here and you see that little hole in the base, that was generated by one of these guys. You can see there's another one right here. So they'll go around and they manage to get the nectar, and then I've seen hummingbirds follow them and they'll actually go and visit those same holes. Not immediately because this guy has already grabbed the nectar. So the plant has to reproduce another load of nectar before it's worthwhile. But now you can see these hummingbirds here, this horned sun gem. It's going to the base of this flower here. A little difficult to see where it's making entry, but here on the cinnamon hummingbird, you can actually see that it's bypassing the petals altogether. And so it's bypassing all the reproductive parts, and it's going right down into the base where the nectar is. So nectar is not their only food source. I'm sure most of you are probably aware of this, but they do eat a lot of insects, and the insects that they're eating, the quantity is going to increase dramatically during the breeding season when we see them. So they need all that extra protein, for feeding the young and everything else that goes into that, raising the young process. So here we have a hummingbird actually fly catching, and I've witnessed that. There was one time I was up in the Andes, just outside of Quito, and I was watching a sword-billed hummingbird. Remember this? So that's that guy that's got, the 4+ inch long bill, and he was just hovering in the air, and he would fly up with his bill opened up as he flew up. And then you'd see it close, and then he would drop down and then wait a second, and then he'd go up and do it again. He kept doing this repeatedly. These insects were so small that I couldn't see what he was flying into, but obviously there was a swarm of insects above him, and he didn't want to disturb that whole swarm. And, with his flapping wings, they'd be blown all over the place, right? So he would just kind of go up and down and up and down. And here's this bird with this, 4+ inch long bill, and he's, actually fly catching. It was pretty cool to see. Here you can see This is probably maybe a broad-tailed hummingbird, and you can see he's got a little food morsel on the end here. Here we have a sapsucker, and so he's drilling holes in a tree, and the hummingbird is now taking advantage of the fact that the sap is available, not to mention the insects that would be also drawn to that sap that would create a food source as well. An interesting thing in migration, the sapsuckers, because they do provide an early source of food for the ruby-throated hummingbird here in the east, they actually are somewhat a control factor in how far north and how quickly ruby-throated hummingbirds can migrate. There's one coming now. He's at the door. So as the sapsuckers are moving north and they're drilling all these sap wells, that's when the hummingbirds are going to come up, and they won't really extend their migration beyond the lead of the sapsuckers, because they can utilize that food source. Because when they're coming up, there really aren't a lot of flowers yet. So they do use the sap a lot, and the sapsucker has a lot to do with that. So in this image here, I don't know how well that's showing up. Yeah, it shows up. So you can see there's a spider web there. So the hummingbirds will actually go to a spider web and pluck insects out of that. It's a very dangerous place for them to be, because they can very easily get tangled in there. But they utilize spider webs in other ways as well that we'll talk about. But in this case, they're actually, catching something that was trapped in the web. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of my travels. So I have a lot of facts that I want to share with you, so you can learn a little bit about hummingbirds, but then I'll keep interjecting little stories and things like that. So this was in 2018, and I made a trip down to Ecuador in January. And one of the big targets on that trip was to get the olive-spotted hummingbird. That was my 200th hummingbird. And it's an island specialist. So this is a hummingbird that only breeds on little islands that are formed in major rivers in the Amazon. And so the part of the island that they take advantage of would be the downstream end. So the upstream end is being eroded by the flow of the water, and then there's a deposition of material on the downstream end. And that's where, once new land or ground has been established there, that's where new plants are going to grow. And it's in that particular habitat that this hummingbird likes to hang out. And there's actually several species of birds aside from hummingbirds that do this. And they focus specifically on those islands in the Amazon. And they're going to actually focus just on that downstream edge of the island. So I was a little distant, and I don't have a very good camera. So this is my olive-spotted hummingbird, but this is what one really looks like if you have a good camera. I was quite thrilled, even though it doesn't look like a spectacular hummingbird. 200 seemed like a pretty nice number to me. So now we're going to do a little bit of storytelling. I guess that was a story too. And on this go around, I was this was in 2015, and we were at Wild Sumaco Lodge. I'm showing you this video just so you can see how aggressive the hummingbirds are. What's going on in this situation is it was raining out. The guys that worked at the lodge were taking down the feeders as they became empty, and they were cleaning them and refilling them, but they weren't putting them back out yet. So you can see this feeder is just about, well, probably pretty close to empty. You can see that in the reservoir, there's no sugar water anymore. So you can see it kind of starts out that, we've got some hummingbird activity here, and there's several species. This is a golden-tailed sapphire just flew off. This is a brown violet ear. And at this feeder, there were probably 4 or 5 different species that were coming in and out. That's a female sapphire, a golden-tailed sapphire. So they're in and out, and as the feeders were being taken down, the activity around the feeders kept increasing. Well, a friend of mine came out of the lodge, and he was carrying a red book. And I noticed immediately that the hummingbirds were very attracted to that red book. So I asked if I could borrow it, and I put it in my lap, and within seconds I had brown violet ears landing on my knee. And then I got the bright idea that, we'll stop this. I got the bright idea that I could put my fingers like little perches on the corners of the book. And here you can see a brown violet ear landed right on my finger. And he kept drilling down into this little dark area, thinking it was like a port on a hummingbird feeder. And his head just kept going down. And there, of course, there was no reward there, right? So finally, all the hummingbird feeders, I think, were gone. The book was also gone. My friend asked for his book back and he went back inside to read. So while he's reading inside, the hummingbird still remembered where that little red book was. So they came back and I had hummingbirds buzzing all around in my lap. And the next thing I felt was on the side of my head. I don't know if I was feeling the actual wings or just the wind off the wings, but I had a golden-tailed sapphire right here at my face, right here where my ear is. So you can connect the dots and know what happened next. That little bill went right in my ear and I felt the tongue go just one time. He tried it out and there was nothing there but earwax. And so he gave up. And then a brown violet ear came up out of my lap and he was right in my face and did the exact same thing to my nose. And he didn't find any nectar either. So it was just totally amazing. And what this story represents is just how aggressive these birds are, how curious they are, how intently they're looking for food sources all the time. So it was just amazing to me. I've been going down there at this point in time. I had been going down into Central and South America, probably 20, 25 years. I've never been this close to hummingbirds. As much as I like them, I've never had them in my face and in my ear. So it was pretty amazing. This was from 2018. And this is at Cawango Lodge, which is just over the hump of the eastern hump of the Andes. So we're on the eastern slope, but barely over. And so here's a sword-billed hummingbird, feeding at a feeder, being harassed by a tourmaline sun angel, which is sitting up on the branch right here. So again, very, very aggressive behavior. If I was going to battle with a thing with a bill 4.5 inches long, I would think twice. So 2018, 3 years after my attack, I'm back at the same place. But this time I came prepared and I had a little baby food jar and I took and painted the rim with the same color as a hummingbird feeder, filled it up with my sugar water, and you can see the reaction of the hummingbirds as I approach them. They're all like trying to back away. What's the matter with this guy? So for some reason, the magic was over and they didn't want to have anything to do with me. So it was very disappointing. I thought I was going to make friends down there. But on that trip, here's some of the birds that we did come across. None of these were new for me, but it was great to see them. This is rufous vented whitetip, which is a eastern slope bird. White-necked Jacobin can be found on either slope. And these two are both western slope species. So violet-tailed sills and velvet purple coronet. They both have counterparts on the eastern slope. Likewise, the rufous vented whitetip has a counterpart on the western slope. That's how it's easy to get so many new hummingbirds, because all you gotta do is go on either side of the Andes and you can get new birds. But on this trip, I actually came up with 65 hummingbird species. None of them were new, but it's the highest number that I've ever reached on a trip. And this was only about a, 12 or 13-day trip, I think, something like that. 65 species of hummingbirds, pretty remarkable. So here's our crew. This is actually at Wild Sumaco Lodge, I believe, is where that picture was taken. And then I had a trip that I did to Colombia, and nothing spectacular here other than the fact that this person in her courtyard has over 70 hummingbird feeders. So you can see all the activity going on in here. I hope that shows up pretty, yeah, it's showing up. So I can't remember what I actually saw at this site, but it was remarkable. I mean, it was like the hummingbirds were like a cloud. So that was pretty cool. So it was just outside of Bogota. And here's some of the birds that we did see on that trip in Colombia. And here's the motley crew right here. There's Diane, who's sitting in row 3 right there. So this is a black-tailed train bear, black Inca, black-throated mango, and here's that bronze-tailed thornbill again. So a lot of diversity. I really get excited when I see these tails that are ornate. So either real long like this, or they've got little bobs on the ends. And I'm intrigued by bill shapes. So I really like the hermits a lot because they do have a unique bill shapes. And then when you see something like a thornbill, you wonder how he's making a living with that little teeny tiny bill. So, I missed so much the fact that I had, made friends at one time in Ecuador, that when we were in Jamaica, there's a reserve, a bird sanctuary that you can go to just outside of Montego Bay. And one of my target birds was there, the red-billed streamer tail. And they have them habituated to people. So, you know, when you go on the airplane and you get those little whiskey bottles, so they empty those and then they drill a little hole in the cap, and that's what they use to feed these hummingbirds. So you hold that little bottle in one hand here, and then here's the streamer tail. And I don't know if you can see it very well, but that tail is going all the way down to here. So it's really, really a cool looking bird. So these are the 4 birds that I was after hummingbird wise in Jamaica. So the Jamaican mango vervain hummingbird, which is only about a 1/4 inch larger than that bee hummingbird we were talking about. And then there's 2 streamer tailed, black-billed and red-billed. Of course, we managed to find all of those with some encouragement on my part to the guides to make sure that we get all those birds. And in 2023, we were making a return trip to Costa Rica, and I still had 3 hummingbirds in that country that I hadn't seen yet. So I was bound and determined, and I set up a itinerary so we could hit really good spots to get all of those hummingbirds. And those 3 are the white-bellied mountain gem, bronzy hermit, and mangrove hummingbird. Again, I'm no photographer, so when they're sitting at a feeder, I get a nice picture. I was just happy to have this picture at all. You can see it's a hermit by the, the curved bill, all this rufous activity here. It's a very dull looking bird compared to our shiny ruby-throated hummingbirds. But what's key on this bird is where the white is on the tail. And here it's all on the little tips of the feathers, whereas there's another bird that looks very, very similar to this, which is the band-tailed barbthroat. And then the white would be at the base of the tail instead of out here at the tips. So it was really good to have this picture so I could verify what I was looking at. And then mangrove hummingbird is just a really tricky guy to get. I know Diane was actually able to see one, I think, at a nest site or near a nest site. And so she had a very cooperative one. But when I was down there, it was a real struggle. And I ended up seeing this mangrove hummingbird on 3 different occasions. And I finally just said, this is good enough, because I just couldn't get a really, really good look at him. I actually fell through a boardwalk the first time on the first encounter. I was so busy trying to locate where the bird was that my foot went right through a crack in the boardwalk, and it was so tight I actually had to have somebody pull me out of there. So here's just a few of the other hummingbirds that I encountered on the trip. And I've seen this bird many times, but this is probably one of the nicest pictures that I have of it. And it's, I don't use any flash. So this is all just natural light causing all this iridescence that we're seeing. This is the scaly-breasted hummingbird that kept chasing away my bronzy hermit. And this is a purple mountain gem female. And it's one of my favorite hummingbirds, a snowcap. Just because of its such unique coloration. It's got that kind of wine color and then that little white cap on top. It's a cute, very cute hummingbird. It has a very restricted range within Costa Rica. Green-fronted lancebill. Again, an interesting bill shape, really long bill. Lesser violet ear, which has a very, very extensive range. So we run into this almost every trip down into the Central and South America. And then here is the best picture I've ever taken of one of those nectar thieves. So this is a slaty flower piercer. I always thought that they used that hook bill to actually kind of carve out that little hole that they were making. So I caught this guy right in the act, and what he's basically doing is he's using that hook bill to latch onto the base of the flower, and he's actually penetrating with the lower mandible. So my hat is off to Mr. Flower Piercer. Pretty cool bird. So here's another one of those nectar thieves. This happened down in Puerto Rico. We were just down there, came back beginning of March. No, end of March. Anyway, recently. So you can see he's going into the base of the flower in order to get at the nectar. Great photo captured by Dennis Stryker. And these were the 5 species of hummingbirds that I was looking for in Puerto Rico: Puerto Rican emerald, green mango, Puerto Rican mango, green-throated carib, which this is, and Antillean crested hummingbird. And Melissa and I actually went down there for about 12 days before the tour started. And then, so we did our own climbing around and exploring. And in the process, I was able to find 4 of the 5 hummingbirds that I wanted to see. It was the Antillean crested is the really tricky one. And out of this group, these three at the top of the list here are actually all endemic. So it's the only place I'm going to find them. That Antillean crested is very difficult to find now because most of the places that it hung out were destroyed in the last hurricane. So its distribution is really messed up right now, and it's kind of hard to locate them. Here's that Antillean crested hummingbird. Again, a very, very short bill on this bird, and then it just has this really unique crest. Really a great looking bird. And so this is photographed by Sirman, who's was one of our board members. I don't know if she's still on the board. No, she has retired. But excellent trip. We had a great time. We got all of the endemics on the island aside from the hummingbirds. So it was very, very fruitful trip. So now we're going to talk a little bit about color. I'm sure you guys will see ruby-throated hummingbirds at your feeders, and sometimes you'll see that it has a nice ruby red throat, and other times it looks black. So have you ever thought about what's going on there? And what's the reason for that? Well, let me fill in the blanks for you. Out of the hummingbirds, especially the typical hummingbirds, they're not wasting any energy on producing pigment. So the only colors that you see that are true colors on a typical hummingbird or the hermits for that matter, you're going to see white, you're going to see black, and you'll see rufous. Everything else that you see on those hummingbirds is created not through pigment, but actually through refraction of light through tiny microscopic air pockets that are in the feathers. And I'm going to show you a schematic here. So if we pluck out one little barb out of the feather, that represents here, and then here's a blow up of that. And if we take that little cross section here, we end up with that, and we end up with these little platelets or air pockets. And so it's the light traveling through that creates the various colors depending on the structure of those little air pockets. And so that's why when we look at a ruby-throated hummingbird at our feeder and the bill or the throat looks black, it's because the light is not hitting it properly. And the birds are actually in control. They know when they're flashing that color at you or at its prospective mate. They will approach so that the light is hitting properly, or they can actually kind of alter their feathers enough that they can, gather that light. So all that's going on is all smoke and mirrors. So when we see bright blues or we see reds or oranges on hummingbirds, that's all coming from this refraction process rather than pigment. Even the greens on the back, that's all refractive light. So here's some examples of close-ups of feathers. And so it might actually look somewhat like it's pigment involved there, but it is actually not. So if this did not have bright light on it, it would all end up looking black. So now let's talk a little bit about nests. And in almost all hummingbird species, it's the female that will, after mating, she will build a nest. She will incubate those eggs. She will feed those young with no help at all from the male. So it sounds like the male has it pretty easy. After he does all that heavy lifting at mating time, she has to carry the ball the rest of the way. But you have to keep in mind that while she's doing all that, he's busy finding his next female. There should be some laughter here. Thank you. So where he's spending all of his time, all of his energy, and all of his hard work is protecting that territory. And that's a lot of work too. Okay. So I have to put in a little good word for Mr. Male Hummingbird. But they do make a lot of really unique nests. These are hermits once again. So here's another hermit. You can see it's not a flashy colored bird, but they're actually building their nest on the tip of a palm frond. And so if we've all been in the tropics at one point or another, we know how palm fronds are. They kind of hang like this, an arching structure, right? So if you build your nest on the underside of that at the tip, you basically have a roof over your nest, and you're in the tropics where there's a lot of rain. So these are positioned specifically so that they're protected from all that rain. And they're using a lot of fibrous material, a lot of plant material. They will also use spider webbing in the construction of their nests. And so where the spider webbing comes into play is that when they wrap all these other materials with that, it's something that's supple. And so as the babies grow within the nest, the sides of the nest can push out. So the nest is basically growing along with the babies. Again, it's a very tricky encounter for them to go to those spider webs because they can get trapped in there. So here's some more typical type of hummingbird nest. This is more what we're used to. And so here you can see this was, I do believe this was a wood nymph nest. This was taken down in Brazil. But here's this huge, huge leaf. So where did they position the hummingbird nest? It was right underneath that leaf. And here's the contents. This is what was inside that when we kind of pulled at the twig and got over it so you could see down in there. This is a very unique looking hummingbird nest, and this is one of the silks that has built this nest. And that's one of the few species that research has shown that the male does assist with at least building the nest. Whether or not they stick around to feed the young, I don't know. But at least they seem to be more engaged than most other hummingbirds. And you get a feel for just how tiny these things are and how the babies barely fit in there. So here's a dime next to that opening of that hummingbird nest. So, I mean, the eggs are like pea-sized. So here's a little video. I hope this works. It wasn't working earlier. Yep, there we go. So it kind of gives you a feel for just how hard it is to locate those nests. If you look up at that branch, you just wouldn't notice that at all. I'll play it one more time, but you know where it is now. But she's way over here, and all of a sudden, boom. So she's still in the process of working on that nest. She's still tucking things in. She's probably still gathering some little lichens to put on the outside for camouflage. This is a female ruby-throated hummingbird that was shot right here in our own area. And then this is a video I shot of a scintillant hummingbird at nests. This was in Costa Rica on my last trip down there. So these birds were really close to fledging. In fact, I went back, because I was moving around a lot when I was taking this video, I wanted to go back and do a stiller shot. And I went back the next day and we were down one baby. So one of them had already fledged and the other one was getting ready to go. So now we're going to talk about another thing. When we think of hummingbirds, it's hard for us to picture them not being in nice little tropical happy places, right? Or in our own little woodlands around here where the elements are not so severe. But there's a lot of hummingbirds that are up in the Andes, and quite a few species are up in that 13,000 to 15,000 foot range. So it's winter every night up there. So they have to have a way of dealing with that. And the way they deal with it is to shut their body down every evening. They go into a state of torpor. And they conserve energy during the day as much as they possibly can. So here, these hummingbirds, these are all Ecuadorian hill stars, magnificent looking hummingbird. But you can see they perch in order to feed. They're not going to hover at a flower when they can just cling to it and feed that way. And here's what the habitat looks like. So very, very sparse in terms of flowers that they can feed on. Of course, they'll use insects as well. But you can see the landscape doesn't provide a lot of sources for them. So in doing that, when they go into torpor, which is basically like hibernation every night, they can lower their body temperature from 100 degrees down to 60 easily enough. And if they need to, if it's going down below freezing, they can lower it all the way down to 45 degrees. Their heart rate stops, or goes, it doesn't stop. It goes down from 1,200 beats down to about 50 beats per minute. So, I mean, that's a huge drop. So the breathing becomes really irregular and it almost stops. So these changes are able to allow for them to save about 85% of their energy. Because remember, these hummingbirds are feeding constantly. They have such normally a very high metabolism. So, if you can imagine them going into this torpor state or even just sleeping overnight in these really cold conditions, they'd be using up so much energy that they wouldn't be able to survive the night. So that's the whole reason for this whole torpor process. The only really bad consequence of that is that as they come out of torpor, they're basically vulnerable. I guess they're vulnerable during torpor as well. But they have to come out of that every morning then and then restart their feeding. So they have a lot of other problems too. Most of them have something to do with Homo sapiens. And so we're killing hummingbirds with pesticides. We're killing hummingbirds by leaving our porch door open or our garage door open. And they, remember, these are little tiny animals, and so their brain is even tinier. And so they can fly in through a garage door and they can't for some reason see their way out. We had that episode just down in Jamaica. We were in the lobby of the lodge, and here was a Jamaican or a Puerto Rican emerald was trapped in the lobby, and he just kept flying at the windows, and he was just, the sill was just high enough I couldn't get up there. But fortunately, our guide was really tall. So he was able to, once the bird kept flowing back and forth, back and forth, it was more or less exhausting itself. It was slowing down. He was able to grab hold of it, and we just took it outside and released it. I've done that before in Ecuador, but with lower sills where I can reach them. But they can easily get trapped in something like that, and they can't figure out how to get out the door they came in, and they end up dying in there. So that's another way that hummingbirds die because of us humans. So you have to watch out for things like that. But there are also natural predators. And down in Central and South America, you have certain raptors that are actually capable of catching hummingbirds. This is a bat falcon here. This is one of the forest falcons. I think this is probably barred forest falcon. And then we have some critters have figured out how to utilize hummingbird feeders as a ambush spot for hummingbirds. So here we have praying mantises that have captured hummingbirds. Here's a hummingbird. This is a ruby-throated hummingbird here. It's gotten caught up on burdock. So I don't know if you've been out in the woods and you're hiking around and you've come in contact with burdock, and you know how sticky that can be. So a hummingbird can't push himself off of that. And I've seen other birds. I actually found a bat one time when I was in McDowell Grove, and I found a bat that had died because it got hung up on burdock. I rescued a Tennessee warbler off of burdock one time, and I know on one of the Christmas counts, I think Joe Suchecki brought in a dead ruby-crowned kinglet, and it was stuck on burdock. I think that's a true story. If Joe's listening tonight, maybe in the chat session, he can verify that that's the true story. Here's a hummingbird that did get hung up in a spider web. And then down in South and Central America, we do have some snakes that are very brightly colored, and so they look like flowers. And they will also ambush hummingbirds when they come in to inspect that possible new food source. So a lot of issues going on. But we don't want to end there because that would be too depressing. So we're going to talk more about what's next for Denis. I'm sure you're all very interested. So I'm organizing a private tour to go down to Chiapas, Mexico. That's going to be in February 2025. Lots of potential there. There could be 8 or 9 species of hummingbirds that would be new for me. A couple of them would be the green-throated mountain gem here, or the rufous saberwing. And I'm planning to also join a tour down to Cuba, and that would be in March of 2025, and that's to go look for that bee hummingbird. That's a huge target for me. It's the smallest, not just the smallest hummingbird, it's the smallest bird in the world. And I think it would be fantastic to be able to see that bird. And there's also a Cuban emerald. So there's 2 endemic birds down there waiting for me. It's worth the trip just for the bee hummingbird, I think. If I go to Dominican Republic, that's supposed to happen in March of 2026. And there's just a couple of hummingbirds there, but one is a Hispaniola emerald, the other is Hispaniola and mango. So another couple of hummingbirds. Anytime I can get any hummingbirds, I'll go, right? But the biggest prize of all is a bird that I'm planning to go see in September of 2026. And this will again be one of my private organized tours. And that's the northern Peru, where I have potentially get 10 new species of hummingbirds. But the biggest target of all will be the marvelous spatulate tail. Just an incredible hummingbird. Look at that tail, it's amazing. This photo was taken by Jesse Fagan, and he will be my guide down there. He was the guy also that captured that Puerto Rican emerald when we were down in Puerto Rico. So I've wanted to see this bird for a very, very long time. So it's been one of my big target birds. Once I see it, it might actually, it might replace the shoebill as my favorite bird in the world. I had a tour planned to go here just coming out of COVID, and with things being so dicey with COVID still, that trip didn't fly. So we're putting it back on the books for September of 2026. Anybody's interested, you can, any of these trips I organize, you can come along for the ride. It's a lot of fun. And that's what I stress. The rewards are getting smaller and smaller, but the fun remains at a very high level. So this was down in Jamaica, and I don't know what all these people were looking at, but I was just having a good time. But I've got a lot of trips coming up. So I've got a couple trips to Colombia on the eastern slopes, the western slopes, the central highlands of Peru, Oaxaca mountain slopes, Argentina, Trinidad and Tobago, and a couple trips to Brazil. So with all of that going on, right now I'm at 226 species of hummingbirds. And I'm hoping that I can maybe in my lifetime get up to about 275 or something like that. There's 366, depending on the taxonomy that you follow. So I've got a ways to go. I have no visions of seeing all of them. That would be impossible, especially considering the fact that so many parts of the world are unfriendly for us now than what we used to experience. You know, there's that gentleman, I don't know his name, but I'm sure all of you have seen the press releases. He saw his 10,000th bird. It was a spider hunter somewhere in, I don't know, was he in Indonesia, I think? Philippines, okay. Yeah, so his 10,000th bird. You know how impossible that is to do now? He worked for the State Department, I guess, for all of his career. And so I'm sure he had stations all over the world and he used those as his satellites to go out and, you know, and see so many different birds. But there's no way that any of us can do that anymore. There's so many places we can't go birding, so many birds that are inaccessible to us. So I don't have any visions about 10,000 and certainly no visions about 366 either. It's one of the biggest bird families in the world, even though they're some of the tiniest birds in the world. I think they're probably maybe the third largest family in the world. So it's a remarkable family, all found in the Western Hemisphere, so they're not that far away. And I will continue to search as much as I possibly can. As long as my body holds out, I'll be looking for hummingbirds. And I think that's it. So next up, we will entertain questions. And we can put lights up perhaps if somebody could do that for us.
I got a question on one of your very first slides, but I can't remember what it was. Can you go back to the first couple slides?
Let's see if I can do that. Yes, it didn't escape me here. So that's the very first slide, not that one. That's the tourmaline sun angel. That's the one that was harassed. That's probably the very individual that we saw in the swordbill video that was harassing the swordbill.
Oh,
This one is it the topaz? Yeah,
is that something that you can see from the air that's really beautiful?
that's the Nazca lines in the desert in Peru. And so there's all of these very amazing illustrations of animals and different shapes. And this one happens to be of a hummingbird. And they were created, I don't know, pardon? They're on the ground and it is actually cut into the ground. And so it's almost like when you're looking at the petroglyphs, I think this is ground, I don't think it's rock, but when you look at a petroglyph, what they've done is they've removed the patina on the rock. And so the white that you're like, so yeah, I'm talking about, there's one right here in front of me. So, so they would chip away the patina off of the rock and that's what leaves this white example. So it almost looks like somebody just went there with chalk, but that's not what happened. They actually removed the layer of stone that was formed, the patina that from aging that's on the rock. And they just chisel that away and that's how they create that image. So I don't know for a fact that that's what's happening here. But certainly the subsoil, at least if nothing else, is a different color. And so that's how that's created. Pardon? I think this is like football field size. I don't know that for a fact. I don't know exactly. And for those of you that are listening at home, if you didn't hear that question, that was our new vice president and was just wondering how this is created. It is amazing, just the fact that they can do these geometric designs because they don't have the advantage of being up in the air to do it. It's staggering to me that they're capable of doing that. And then this one too, I mean, so this lady had to stand still for all of that. That's not Melissa's shoulder, by the way. So this is an Inuit drumhead. That's what this one is. And then this is just, you know, some kind of pottery. But you can see that, you know, there's so many cultures that have taken advantage of or have appreciated hummingbirds and they've incorporated them, you know, into their culture. So I think it's really interesting. Any other questions? Any other slides you want to see again? Yes.
Can you talk more about the regular hummingbirds and is there, I mean, like if you look at one of them, can you tell which one is because of the bill and the lack of coloration?
You come right up here and you do this talk.
Oh, no, so that's it.
Yeah.
That is-
So the question is, how do you differentiate really between the typical hummingbirds and the hermit family? And that's pretty much exactly it. So you're talking about bill shapes. So often those hermits end up being those trap liners, and so they do have very unique bill shapes. So they have that going for them. You're not going to see too many. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. There are typical hummingbirds that have a decurved bill. A lot of the mangoes have decurved bills, but not to the extreme that you see in the hermits. The hermits, really have a super curvature to it. And then if you look at that sickle bill, I mean, it's like a real sickle. So you have that bill shape is one thing, and you mentioned the coloration, and that's another one. So they just look very dull compared to the typical hummingbirds, which are going to have way more of that iridescence. So the hermits, when you see the coloration on them, you're really looking at pigments. So all those rufusy colors, that's generated by actual pigment.
They would be more, in the dark, part of the forest. And so
Well-
they wouldn't need the color.
Very good point. So quite often where we see those is in subtropical to tropical areas. You do get them in montane to some extent, but in many of them are actually, lower forest type birds. So yeah, once you're in that understory, it's amazing how little light can get down. Yeah, so they don't have that advantage. And the way that they breed quite often, the hermits, is that they set up leks. So our typical hummingbird, the ruby-throated hummingbird, he establishes a territory, and that territory could be someplace else every year. And when you go out walking around in the forest preserves over the next month or so, and you keep finding a hummingbird sitting on a little dead twig every time you walk that path, well, that's that male, and he's watching his territory. You're in the middle of his territory. So he has the approach of, he has a territory and he guards that territory. The hermits, quite often, they have a lek. So there will be multiple male hermits in the lek, and they're waiting and attracting females, and then, there's the selection process, and off they go. So they're not protecting the territory. Again, they're trap liners. Try to protect the trap line. You leave a flower and you're going on to the next one. Well, somebody else can be robbing it, or somebody could be robbing the one ahead of you. There's no way to protect the trap line. So all good characteristics that would help you kind of discern. And if you see a trap lining hummingbird like a hermit, and you say, oh, I think it was this one, but I got to get a better look. Well, you can stay there a very long time before he runs that trap line again. So you may never see him again. So that's another way you can tell it's a hermit. He's not coming back. Any other questions? Yes, Bruce.
As a selfish human, one of my curiosities is what we might know about the ecology of hummingbirds and what selfish gains they provide for humans, or stretching it out a bit, how they fit into other ecologies. If we know anything about it.
Okay, so the question was,
Good are
or the statement that Bruce made is that he's selfish, and he's wondering if hummingbirds are selfish too. Well, that's a really good one, Bruce. I would say that hummingbirds are what they're providing is certainly that most of them are playing fair, and so they are providing that role of the pollinator. So that's a good thing. So without them fulfilling that, we would lose plant species. Other animals may not have food sources that develop because those flowers were pollinated, right? So there's that aspect that's very good, but they are also very, very selfish. I'm sure in your own backyard, you've seen how aggressive hummingbirds can be around the feeder. So because they have that real high metabolism and they are constantly looking for that food source, they're constantly looking around for that. And so when they have a food source and it is in their territory, those ruby-throated are very aggressive, and they're going to chase everybody out all the time. They're just chasing them out. They want it for them and for them, just themselves. So there's not a lot of sharing that goes on with hummingbirds. Yeah, very aggressive guys. So that's a little snippet. I don't know. I'm gonna lose sleep on that one. So I'll be thinking about it tonight. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm very into the birding world. Last year I bought a hummingbird feeder. I thought it'd be, good for the birds, make them happy. So I was talking to some people the very next day and they said, oh no, that's a terrible thing to do. You don't want to put out bird feeder, plant flowers. So I'm just wondering, is a bird feeder a good thing to do, or would you better plant flowers? Is a bird feeder harm the birds in any way, or what?
So the question was, are hummingbird feeders any good at all? And are we harming birds by feeding them using the hummingbird feeder? So I have a lot to unpack on that. So for one thing, remember the rufous hummingbird that showed up on December 1st. No flowers. It's mostly surviving off of that feeder, but it wasn't there constantly. So it had other food sources. It was either finding insects or it was going to a tree wound where sap was running or something. So the bottom line of what I'm saying there is that the hummingbird had multiple food sources, even though there was an easy meal at the hummingbird feeder.
What
He
is
did
the
not
sugar
eat there.
water? Is sugar water?
Well, I'm gonna get there.
Oh,
Yeah, I have a long answer. So that example shows us that the hummingbird feeder was good, because this hummingbird was really hurting. It was late in migration. It was a lifeline for that hummingbird. But even so, he staked out that hummingbird feeder, hung around there a lot, but that was not its sole source of food. So a hummingbird feeder is not going to be its only source. It's not going to prevent it from migrating, because 3 or 4 days later, that bird fattened up. The people who owned the house, they said that the behavior changed dramatically the one day, and it was just feeding like crazy and then gone. So it was carving up and getting ready to go. So it knew what it was doing. So there's that side of the story. Now the injury part. I had a woman, I've been doing this talk for many years, well, various talks. This is a brand new talk. I've never done this one before. But I've done a lot of hummingbird talks. I had a woman out in Kane County. She would come out, and every time I did a talk on hummingbird, she'd come out and she would say, hummingbird spleens are exploding. I'm like, show me something that says that. And I would search the internet. And she said that in Colorado, they were outlawing hummingbird feeders because of this. And I'm like, I go to Colorado all the time. I see hummingbird feeders all over the place. I could never find anything that said spleens were exploding or any other internal organ on a hummingbird. So going back somewhat to the rufous hummingbird example, they don't feed on the feeder exclusively. None of our birds do. So you can look at all our songbirds. How much time do they spend on the ground around your feeder or in the feeder? And how much time are they out foraging in the rest of your yard or somebody else's yard? You don't see them the rest of the day. You see them in the beginning of the day, but then not later. So they're out foraging, doing their natural thing. It's an easy source. They grab a few things. They're advantageous. You know, it's a survival thing. So there's some food there. They're going to go grab it. So having any kind of feeder is not a bad thing. The birds utilize it, but they don't utilize it exclusively. I've had people ask me, will a feeder keep a bird from migrating? The rufous hummingbird example is a good one that shows that it will not. And, you know, birds come and go through my yard all the time. I'm not seeing anybody as a hanger around. My neighbor just had a junco in his yard for a couple of days. So I was all set to get that for the spring count. And 2 days before the count, it was there. And I sat in my yard and waited and waited and waited, and that junco wasn't there. And then the next day, the first bird I saw in the morning was that darn junco. So he was still hanging around, but obviously not exclusively using that feeder, right? So the feeders are a good thing. As long as you clean your hummingbird feeder regularly. Every time you change the fluid in there, you should take it in, you should scrub it up. You should have 2 hummingbird feeders, okay? So you can have one all clean, lickety split and ready to go. And then when you take the other one in, you put the new one out, and then you can clean the one that you just brought in and let it dry. Make sure all your, whatever you're using, if it's soapy water or bleach or whatever you're using to clean it, make sure that you rinse it, triple rinse, and then, let it dry out. So, but there's a lot of work involved in feeding hummingbirds. It's easy to just hang a feeder out there and hope for the best, but you're doing more damage doing that, because then bacteria can grow, and that's a problem. So you do have to have a little more care when you're feeding hummingbird feeders.
Is that like every other day? You have to clean it?
No, if it's cool enough, they can go a week. When in the middle of summer, it's shorter amount of time. I actually surprisingly, in our YouTube library, the Bird Club has an education library. There are all sorts of tutorials in there. Guess what? There's one in there on how to attract hummingbirds to your yard and how to take care of them.
Thanks very much.
The guy that recorded that is really top notch. He's a great really knows his stuff. So, yeah, it tells you how to clean it, tells you how to mix your own mixture, so you don't have to buy the nectar juice from the store or anything like that. You can mix, it's a 4-to-1 ratio, easy to mix. You can either mix it in a big batch and just put a little out at a time. Because let's say you only have 1 or 2 hummingbirds in your yard, there's no point in filling that reservoir, because it's gonna go bad before it's ever emptied. So you put a little out there, and then you go and put a little more out there and a little more out there. And I told you I had a long answer on this, a lot to unpack. So it's very important what kind of feeder you buy. So I try to buy hummingbird feeders that have large reservoir openings. And that, like the satellite dish, you can actually take that apart. I don't use bee guards because that just is another place for bacteria to grow. So the simpler your hummingbird feeder is, the better, because it's going to be easier to wash, because you're going to faithfully do that every time you bring it in. So that the easier you make it on yourself, the more you're going to be helping those hummingbirds, because you're doing a good job on cleaning it now. So if you watch that tutorial, it talks about, I can't remember the brand name that I use, but it has the plastic reservoir that's on top. I mean, the opening is like this big, so you can get in there with a scrubby brush. Some of these, they've got a little opening like this, like a Pepsi bottle or Pepsi, bottle. I mean, you can't get in there and clean everything thoroughly. The same thing with the satellite. If you can break that open, it actually turns and it opens up into 2 parts, and you can get in there and get every little nook and cranny. So let's ask our web designer.
On the DBC education channel on YouTube. Oh, okay, okay. YouTube, www.youtube.com/DuPage Birding Club. Thank you. We'll bring you to all the videos.
You could also,
Recordings.
if you're looking for that one in particular, because it's a whole library, I've got 60 recordings out there myself. All of our club meeting or most of them get recorded and are out there. Joe Suchecki has some on bird song. So there's quite a library out there now. I bet you there's at least 80, if not more, recordings out there. So one way you could also go for is Google my name and hummingbird feeders, and you'll probably get the one you want.
Thanks a lot. Good on YouTube.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, thank God for COVID. Because that's when we recorded all those. I was doing 3 a week. Any other questions? Okay, my book signing will be in the back. And all right, well, thanks a lot for coming out, you guys. Appreciate it.